Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Paul Simon with Questions for the Angels. And he is starting us off this week because I want to discuss a few questions, 20 questions in fact, because there has been a recent book called The Big Questions in Science, The Quest to Solve the Great Unknowns. And this has been profiled in The Guardian, so you might have seen a little bit of news about this recently. It's written by two researchers who are interested in pinpointing the major 20 questions that we still have to address as scientists, and to kind of look at the progress that we've made so far and the things that need to be done, and whether some of these things are likely to actually ever be answered, or whether there may be going to be questions that will puzzle us as humans for as long as we continue. And I thought that these were quite interesting, especially because some of them are ones that I've mentioned right here on the show before. So I wanted to go through each one of those and discuss a little bit about what the authors have said. Now I'm kind of quoting from their own write-up that they produced in the newspaper. And of course, if you want to get more detail than I'm going to go into today, then you'll want to track down the book. And I'll put a link to the book on the Wildside website so you can check that out. And the authors I should mention are Kight and Haley Birch, in case you want to try to track that down before I get a chance to update the webpage. So I'm not sure if they've actually arranged these questions in terms of how important they think that they are, but the first one certainly is quite an important one, and it is, what is the universe made of? And what we know so far is that atoms make up only about 5% of the universe, even though if you ask most people, that's what they'll say is the fundamental thing that we find out there in the world. But actually, that's a very, very small part of what's out there. The remaining 25% is still 95% is still kind of mysterious. Now, since the 30s and the 80s, we kind of have, in two different steps, figured out what these things generally are, and that's dark matter and dark energy. And dark matter is known to act as kind of a glue, while dark energy is responsible for this expansion of the universe and the increasing speed with which it is expanding. But really beyond that, we don't know that much about these things, and we don't know how they interact with each other, how they achieve the things that they seem to achieve, and kind of, what happens, how do these come into being, how will they interact with the things that are around us, the atoms that we know about. So all sorts of things that we could explore in greater detail to understand what the universe is made up of and how it came to be. And speaking of coming into being, the next question on the list is, how did life begin? And researchers since, I think the 60s have hypothesized that probably there was some sort of an event that literally sparked, maybe with a little bit of energy, some lightning perhaps, life into being. So we had this kind of primordial soup that had a bunch of nutrients in it, it had a bunch of chemicals, and somehow slowly into being came some form of life. And really life is quite a difficult thing to describe, and people use a lot of different metrics, but one of the most basic things is that it's something that is able to replicate itself. You've got molecules that can produce more molecules that are like them. And so at some point, something happened that allowed the molecules that were just hanging around in that primordial soup to replicate themselves in some way and come up with a new generation. And we really need to understand how that happened. How did these basic chemicals on Earth arrange themselves into something that would allow them to create more of themselves and pass on that information? How did those earliest things eventually form DNA? Because it's unlikely that DNA just spontaneously came into being. It was probably something that kind of evolved over time as things got better and better in terms of reproducing themselves, and that structure was enabling that, and so that's probably how we converged on that particular format. And what did these first organisms look like? Did they look like the kind of archaebacteria that we find in really extreme environments? Do they look like cells that are recognizable to us? Or are they something really strange and unusual? A lot of people have looked at some of the really basic proteins, the RNA and things like that, and even clay bits, and said, maybe these are all things that were the precursors to life. and we really have no idea. And this is an interesting question in case you're curious about kind of the origins of the Earth, but it also is something that's really useful if you want to try to figure out where other life might be found in our solar system and in the universe beyond. And even if you're thinking about trying to figure out where on our planet we might find more life forms that we haven't already discovered, these sorts of things might be really useful because we could uncover really ancient strains of things that are living in remote places that we haven't yet reached or studied in much detail. Now, I kind of already touched on the next question in this discussion of how life could begin, but the next question on the list is, are we alone in the universe? So obviously there is a lot of interest in understanding what's out there beyond Earth and whether or not life could form on other planets. And of course, really basic to that is just understanding whether we are the only organisms that are alive in the entire universe. And that's kind of a mind-boggling idea because our solar system is vast, our galaxy is vast, and the universe beyond it is even vaster. And it's incomprehensible, really, that out of all of that space and out of all the time that it's been in being, we'd be the only organisms. But so far we haven't found really any signs of life elsewhere, even though now that we have begun really researching Mars in more detail, we are finding some signs that potentially life could at some point have been there, or maybe have visited there and gone away again, or even come to Earth from there, who knows. So this is a really fascinating thing for us to look into, and one of the really key parts of this is finding planets that are like ours, in particular finding planets with water. Now we do kind of make some assumptions in thinking that planets with life are going to have water, but water has been a really key part of life on Earth, and many people will tell you that if we didn't have water, and the strange angle that water molecules form that make water have the properties that it does have, we wouldn't have life at all on this planet. So it is a really critical part of our existence, and so finding it on other planets would be a really exciting sign, because it could, in fact, provide the same sort of nurturing habitat that it provided here and continues to provide. Another thing that researchers are looking into is whether there are any radio signals that we can detect that indicate forms of alien communication. And I didn't realize this, but apparently a few years ago there was something detected that seemed to have some sort of, pattern that was indicative of not just randomness, but maybe it was actually a signal. But so far there haven't been any breakthroughs. I think we all would have heard them on the news. So the researchers are still searching for any signs of communication from elsewhere. And what's really amazing is that if you think about how enormous the universe is, organisms that would be trying to reach us with broadcasts, so for example radio waves, would actually be really, really distant in time. By the time their signal finally got to us, it would be hundreds, thousands, millions of years, depending on how far away their planet is. So actually just the scale over which it would take us to locate these other organisms and vice versa is another really mind-boggling thing. The next question on the list, number 4, is what makes us human? And this question goes beyond the question of what sorts of genes do we have in our genome, because we know that the human genome, for example, is 99% similar to the chimp genome, or even 50% similar to the banana genome. And obviously there's got to be something beyond just the A's and the C's and the T's and the G's that make up our DNA, that make us what we are as humans. And there are lots of things that people have proposed as really important differentiating characteristics. So for example, our large and complex brains. And some people have said that because we developed the ability to create fire and to cook food over fires, we were able to provide ourselves with the amount of calories that we needed to grow the giant brains that we have. So maybe it has something to do with those abilities and that physical structure. Maybe it's the relationship that we have between culture and genes. So the fact that there is nature and nurture that both influence who we are and what we are, and these things work together to help us evolve as an organism. Potentially it has to do with kind of the culture aspect alone, so the fact that humans are really able to cooperate with each other and develop skills and pass on skills. And these are things that are seen in other organisms as well, in animals I should say, but it's really to an extent in humans that we don't see elsewhere in the animal kingdom. So maybe this is what distinguishes us as humans. And obviously it's going to be a very difficult thing to ever fully answer, especially because we keep finding out new things about other organisms, and we keep finding abilities in other animals that we thought were unique to humans. So it's always going to be a changing definition, but maybe we can eventually narrow in on something that kind of defines us as what we are. And a part of that may in fact be answering question number 5, which is, what is consciousness? And we know that consciousness is related to the networking of different parts of the brain. But what we don't really know is which parts of the brain are most important in that process. How does the circuitry work that connects these different parts of the brain? Can we use this sort of information then to create artificial intelligence and create replacement brains and actually manufacture de novo a human brain? Or is there something special that happens? Is there some sort of soulful thing that makes consciousness what it is, and it's not something that you can scientifically create? And another question that's kind of associated with this is, how did consciousness, or why did consciousness even develop to begin with? Is it something that was evolutionarily useful, or did it completely happen by chance? And some people have suggested that perhaps it's related to the fact that we have a lot of sensory inputs, and so it's really important for us to be able to distinguish what's real versus what's not real, what's important and what's not important, to plan ahead, to think about things in a different kind of context and not just have what's in front of us at a given time. So understanding kind of the origins of this might help us then to create it and to understand how it functions and what things are involved in creating it. Now, the next thing on the list is something that I just mentioned, I think, in last week's show, or certainly very recently in any case, and it's the question of why we dream. So as I've mentioned before, dreaming does seem to be related to memory, also to learning and to emotions. But why do we spend so much time doing it? I mean, we spend about a third of our lives sleeping. We actually sleep even more when we're young, so that's particularly interesting for the developmental stage. And how does it work that it has all of these effects on us? We rely on this to kind of recharge. Whenever we don't get enough sleep, things really fall apart quickly. And as I mentioned last week, you can actually end up with death because of lack of sleep. And we really still have very little understanding of why this thing is such an important part of our lives. Another big question that seems actually kind of humorous because it seems so basic is, why do we have stuff? Why is the universe, at least the portion of it that we're living in, full of things? And the reason this is an interesting question is that during the Big Bang, we think, at least, because of course this is all based on models, we don't have, firsthand observations of this event, but we think that there were equal parts of matter and antimatter that were created during the Big Bang. And the two of these things cancel each other out. So if you've got them both together, then you've got nothing at all. So why is it that despite the fact that you've got 50-50 of these two things that should interact and then kind of cause the vanishing of all stuff, why do you still have matter that is aggregating and able to form objects that haven't just winked out of existence after they've interacted with antimatter? And does this mean that there's some sort of a subtle bias towards the state of matter in nature? Is there something that influences it? So like the concept of supersymmetry, is it affected by neutrinos? And physics professors don't really know. These are just kind of ideas that they've come up with to begin with, but there are lots of questions that we have out there that relate to the universe. Another big one is the next one on the list, and that is whether this is the only universe or whether there are others. And one of the things that is getting more and more support from research and from models is the idea that there's actually something called a multiverse, which contains every possible combination of settings, of states of existence, of ways that things could have come into being or happened at some point or another. And so basically that's the idea that you have not just this universe that we're living in, but lots of other universes that are like it in some ways and unlike it in others. There might be different versions of us. There might be no us at all because life is not possible. And there are all sorts of possibilities. And, maybe some of those universes don't have stuff because the matter and the antimatter cancel each other out. That, it's practically impossible, at least as of now, for us to actually sample these things and find this out definitively. And this is actually one of the things that researchers are trying to figure out by doing the experiments that they're doing at the Hadron Large Collider. Because if we find out some, of the fundamental bits and pieces about physics, we might be able to then kind of put together a better understanding of the universe. And right now we've got cosmological research and quantum physics research both presenting evidence that there might in fact be multiverses, and what we're trying to do is now kind of align these two things and put all of that data into a single model. Now moving on from outside the Earth, coming back to Earth for a little while, the next question on the list is, where do we put all of the carbon? And as everyone doubtless knows by this point, we released a bunch of carbon dioxide in particular into the atmosphere, and now we've got a warming climate. So if we want to reverse that, and if we want to kind of increase our tenure here on the Earth, we're probably going to need to do something with all the carbon. And one of the big ideas right now is that we could bury it in old oil and gas fields. So basically we'd be taking the carbon right back to the place that we extracted it from to begin with. And it would be in a different form, but it would still be that same carbon that we had released from those areas. Another idea is that we might be able to sink it to the bottom of the sea. But one of the questions is, if we do these sorts of techniques, or whatever other idea you can come up with, is it going to work? What will the repercussions be for the whole ecosystem? How long will the carbon stay there if we inject it? Will we put it in and have it come right back out a few years later, or will it stay there for as long as it would have stayed there without humans to interfere in the first place? And another big related question is whether we can come up with alternative energy sources that we can use so that we avoid releasing more carbon. And of course, it's also going to be important to protect particularly good carbon stores that we've already got in place. So things like forests and peat bogs and other places that contain lots of carbon that we don't want to get rid of and just release into the atmosphere so that it adds to the problem. Now, one last thing before I cut to a bit of a music break is really related to that, and that's the question of how we get more energy from the sun. And of course we all know that we've got solar panels, but the idea is that, of course we can always keep refining solar panels and make them better and better, but is there another way besides this technology to capture the heat and energy of the sun and turn it into something that we can use to run all of our equipment? And one idea is that you could use sunlight to split water into oxygen and hydrogen, and this could then be used as clean fuel. And people are researching this really intently and trying to find in particular hydrogen cells that can run cars. And there has been some progress with this, but it's still not a really stable thing. It's not something that we can get lots of energy from. It doesn't really seem to have any long-term kind of possibility just yet, but people really are working on this. And another idea is that we might be able to even recreate conditions like those that occur within the sun right here on the Earth. So we could have giant nuclear fusion machines that we could harness energy from. And of course, as we know, the sun is extremely powerful. So these things have the potential to be quite dangerous, but also incredibly rewarding if we can figure out, how to kind of recreate the sun right here on Earth. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was Neil Young with Unknown Legend. And today, or at least to start off today, I am talking about what some researchers think are the 20 biggest questions left to science. And the next one on my list, number 11, is actually one that I would never have come up with on my own because I just didn't know enough to realize this was important or interesting. And it's the question of what's so weird and unusual and interesting about prime numbers. And you may not know this, but prime numbers are key to encryption and so are used every day online. And I guess I should back up a step and remind you, in case you haven't had math in a while, that prime numbers are numbers that can only be divided by themselves or by the number 1. So they're quite unique and interesting in kind of a mathematical sense if you're a bit of a number nerd. And as I said, these are used in encryption, and so they're really important to allowing us to have certain web access. We can spend money online this way. We can send emails and not worry about them being hacked. So this is a really important part of our everyday existence, but we don't know much about these numbers, and there are so many unusual things about them whenever you throw them into equations and the way that they kind of interact with other numbers. And people, of course, have obsessed over this for a very long time. And they're, in fact, for hundreds of years, and mathematicians have pored over the books trying to figure out, why do these things work the way they do, and what sorts of properties do we find across all of them. And there is actually something called the Riemann hypothesis, which suggests that there is some inherent pattern within prime numbers. And recently you might have seen in the news that researchers discovered the largest prime number ever discovered, and it has, countless numbers. It's something like 16 numbers that make it up. I mean, it's well beyond billions, if I remember correctly. But we don't really know much about how these things operate, so it is kind of a frontier of mathematics, if you like. The next question, completely unrelated to math whatsoever, it's the question of how do we beat bacteria. And again, this is something I have touched on before on the show, the fact that bacteria are really essential to us, so we have lots that are our friends, if you like, but there are also others that are quite problematic. And this is especially true because we have a growing problem of antibiotic resistance. And in fact, some researchers have suggested that not only are we selecting for antibiotic resistance in bacteria, but we're also selecting for the ability of certain bacteria to evolve that resistance even more quickly, because we're just kind of putting these things together in giant cocktails where they're exposed to genes that confer resistance, and they're exposed to the products that are trying to kill them off. And so they're under this extreme pressure to pick up all the good genes and to get rid of all the bad genes. And it is allowing them to become stronger and stronger. And this is a real problem because antibiotics are an essential part of modern medicine. They're one of the things that kind of characterizes modern medicine, the fact that we can get rid of infections fairly easily. But now we have lots of infections that are resistant not only to a single antibiotic, but actually to multiple antibiotics all together. So you can't come up with anything that you can use to treat these particular infections. And of course that is extremely dangerous, because that means that you can only rely on the human immune system, which isn't always strong enough. And in some cases, these are diseases that have been around us for a long time, and so they have learned exactly how to compromise our defenses and bring us down. So this is quite a scary thing. And it kind of stems from lots of things, but in particular, the overprescription of antibiotics for us. So people just get them at the drop of a hat rather than kind of, letting our body's natural processes try to take care of them until it's absolutely necessary. And also overuse on farms. So the fact that we give animals these things and then kind of distribute animal waste products around the environment, so that we've just got antibiotics and the resistant genes, as I mentioned earlier, just being spread all over the place. And that's quite a dangerous cocktail. So one of the things that we can do, other than just kind of limiting the unnecessary use of antibiotics, is to try to discover new ones. And we're doing this quite a lot with DNA sequencing. And I have mentioned before on the show, I think, the fact that a lot of these microorganisms have natural defenses to each other. So if we are able to harvest a lot of these bacteria, and even things like algae and fungi, all sorts of little organisms that live in the same environment with each other and are trying to kind of beat each other out or kill each other off, a lot of them do have natural chemical defenses to each other. And so we can sample from those guys and sequence them and find out what these things are that they produce, and then try to use those for ourselves. The next question on the list is can computers keep getting faster? And if so, how is that? So a lot of people are beginning to think that we are reaching the limit of what we can put into a single computer chip. These things have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time, and I recently read that the amount of computer power, the cumulative amount of computer power that was available to send people to the moon in the 60s is actually exceeded by the amount of power that we have in our cell phones, each one of us in our pocket. And that's a really incredible thing to think, that we went from needing massive machines that had really no RAM, no memory, they weren't able to do all that much, to now having these little tiny things that have not only just as much capacity, but even more. It's an amazing advancement. But we are kind of getting to the point where we've gotten really, really small, and you can only fit so many things on a little small surface. So is that going to be it, or are we going to come up with new methods of computing? And one thing that researchers are trying out is using atomically thin carbon, which is also known as graphene, and also things like quantum computing. So we're not just looking at new materials, we're also looking at totally new systems. So kind of stay tuned and see what we can come up with in order to make our electronics even more exciting than they already are. Maybe we'll eventually have some of these things that we now see in sci-fi films and TV shows. Another question on the list is whether we'll ever cure cancer. And I think the authors of the book have the strong feeling that we probably won't ever cure cancer because it's such a massive thing. In fact, it's so many things all together. But there is something that we can do to kind of minimize the risk and combat it at each stage. And the reason that they think that we'll never really cure it is the fact that the risk is hardwired into all of us, because cancer comes from our genes, and it comes from the fact that our genes are exposed to things in the environment that make little genetic problems that then cause the genes to proliferate. The genes aren't proliferating so much as causing cells to proliferate in an unnatural way. So as long as we are in existence and have DNA within us, as long as we're in an environment that has toxins of some sort or another, or has sun rays or whatever it is out there causing the mutations, we're going to have a risk of cancer. This is particularly true that because we have a greater risk of cancer as we age, and we're now living even longer than we ever were before. So it's just increasing the likelihood that at some point we are going to develop cancer. But what we can do is to kind of minimize the risk of cancer. We can develop ways to get rid of cancer faster, to understand how and why and when it develops, and then get it right away. So actually, if you guys have seen Elysium, then you'll know that they have these amazing machines that can immediately get rid of cancer. You just go lie in them, and they kind of scan you and take out the offending genes, the offending cells, and then you're safe again. And I think that is the kind of thing that these authors were thinking about. You know, if we can figure out how cancer starts and how it spreads, we might be able to figure out how to treat it and prevent it much better. And so even if cancer is still going to emerge, we can nip it in the bud before it kills us off or has other really serious health repercussions. Now, from that kind of somber topic to one that's a bit more fun, that's the next question of when can I have a robot butler? And of course, we do already have lots of robots that can perform basic tasks. I, for example, have a little vacuum cleaner that will take care of the house while I'm gone. Although actually, to be honest, my little robot causes as much trouble as it saves. But the point is that we do have things that can do things for us. But what we really want, if we want to have something like a robot butler, or something like what we see in the Jetsons, is something that has a bit more intelligence. And so we need to create artificial intelligence so that we can have intelligent robots that can kind of gauge what it is that we want. They can converse with us, they can anticipate things, they can interact with us like humans would interact with us. So we do need to kind of up our game a little bit and come up with something that's a bit more realistic and a bit more human. And the Japanese actually are kind of pioneering this a bit. And if you've ever watched, I think I saw an episode of QI where Stephen Fry had on one of the models from one of the Japanese developers, and it's an amazing little thing. You know, they look like little people, and they can now run the way that people run, and evidently that's quite a hard thing to do just because of the mechanics of it all. But the Japanese are really paving the way here, and one of the reasons that they're really interested in this is that they do have quite an aging population, and they want to have robotic aids that can help care for older people as they age and need help. And in fact, they now have a goal of having developed a robotic aid by the time that 2025 rolls around. So within the next 12 years or so, they hope to have things that we can have in our homes to help us out like human assistants, only they're completely robotic. Now the next question on the list, and we are drawing to the end, so these are kind of the biggie questions that are left over, is what's at the bottom of the ocean? And this is kind of exciting because a lot of the other questions on this list, in fact the next one as well, have to do with outer space and the aspects of our universe that are not terrestrial. But this one is very much something that we theoretically could investigate right here on our planet. We can physically go there, unlike a lot of the other places in our universe that we could probably never physically go to. But we've only explored about 5% of the entire ocean, which is really an amazingly small fraction when you think about how long we've been around and how many boat trips there have been. But we've barely scratched the surface because it's so deep, and the ocean covers so much of our planet. So we really know very little, comparatively, about what the seafloor is like and what sorts of creatures are down there. And because we don't know those things, we can't even begin to imagine what we could use with that knowledge once we get it. And of course, you don't have to use knowledge in any way. It might just be interesting. But it's also true that organisms down there might have chemicals in them that we could use as drugs, or they might have certain morphologies that would inspire us to come up with, artificial limbs or something like that. You can think outside of the box and just think about all the crazy creatures that we've found already and imagine what we might uncover if we go down there and how that might influence our thinking about the natural world. And it is quite an exciting thing. And that's, I think, a big reason why James Cameron recently went down. I read an interview with him where he talked about how it's so unknown, and because it's an accessible unknown, he felt that drive to go down and just see what hadn't been seen before. Speaking of which, another big question on the list is what's at the bottom of a black hole. And of course, this is going to be a much more tricky environment to go visit personally, but it is quite an interesting thing because black holes, there's something that everyone says eventually they could create wormholes and allow us to travel through time. And so black holes are always things you see being used in sci-fi movies, but the reality of them is much more mysterious. So according to Einstein's theory of general relativity, a black hole is created when you've got a massive dying star that collapses in on itself and continues to cave in until it forms a really tiny and extremely dense point, because all of that matter is just condensing into one little bit, and that one little bit is called a singularity. And what is that singularity like? What's it look like? What's it feel like? How do you get there? How do you experience it? And what does it do? Does it just hang around like that forever, or does something eventually happen? And we don't really know. And quantum physics is something that can help us learn more, but there's not really a unifying theory that kind of relates quantum physics with the theory of relativity. And recently, people who do physics and math and this kind of theoretical work, they have come up with something called the M theory that may finally achieve some unification of quantum physics and Einstein's theories. But that, the jury is still out on that. The next big question is whether we can live forever. And this is kind of an interesting thing because we have begun to look at aging like it's a disease. So it's something that we can treat, and it's something that we can kind of prevent, and we are living longer and longer, as I've mentioned a few times already. And we're learning more about DNA damage and metabolism and reproductive fitness and regulatory genes and all sorts of biological processes and states that influence the length of time that we're able to stay alive. And potentially this information could help us develop drug treatments and also develop kind of best practices, ways that you should live in order to extend your life as long as possible. But probably an even better question is, if we do extend our lives, can we live well? So there's a big difference between, living for a very long time but being really miserable at the end, and living for a really long time in kind of a state of perpetual youth, or at least perpetual health. And so that's going to be another big question. You tie those two things in together. So we need to focus not only on length of life, but also treating, minimizing, preventing altogether age-associated conditions. So things like becoming senile, developing Alzheimer's, having cancer, having your bones become quite brittle, that sort of thing. We want to minimize that as much as possible, so if we are alive, we're quite comfortable when we are. Now, very closely related to this is the next question on the list, which is how do we solve the population problem? So in addition to having some countries that have really booming populations, we also have a lot of countries that have aging populations because we are living longer. And so we've suddenly got more people on the planet because we've got lots of young people that are being born and lots of older people that are hanging around longer. And by 2050, there are estimates that there might be as many as 9 billion humans on the planet. And this raises a lot of questions as to whether we'll have enough food, whether we'll have enough space to live in the places that we need and want to live, if we want to have, commerce, if we want to grow crops in certain areas. Raises the questions of what fuels we'll use for things and whether our future might eventually involve, things like extraterrestrial colonies or lab-grown food or other types of sci-fi solutions that might be necessary to help us all fit and help us all have the things that we need to have in order to stay alive. Now finally, the last question on the list of the 20 biggest questions left in science is the question of whether time travel is possible. And what's fascinating, and I didn't realize this before I read this little summary of the book, but people actually have worked out how we might use time travel by combining kind of wormholes, which I mentioned earlier, and spaceships, and some crazy physics that my mind can't even begin to understand. But evidently it's more likely that you could, I think I've got this right, that you could time travel forward as opposed to time traveling backwards. And actually, if you want to get technical about it, astronauts that have gone out to space and then come back to Earth have experienced a form of time travel because time passes differently for them out there than it does for us here. But that's probably not what you're thinking about whenever you think of the concept of time travel. Probably something more like Back to the Future. And that is a huge question. Will we ever be able to do something like that? And it is quite a neat idea, but it sounds like the physics of it are very difficult. But if you want to know more details, you're going to have to get the book because I'm afraid that I just can't grasp those sorts of things. And just to mention it again one last time, all of these big questions have been proposed by Mun Keat Louie and Haley Birch, who wrote the book The Big Questions in Science, The Quest to Solve the Great Unknowns. So I will leave it at that, and if your curiosity is piqued, I will put all that information onto the Wildside website in case you want to track this book down. But for now, you can just think about those little summaries and think which questions do you think are the most important, and maybe there are some that weren't even mentioned here. So with that, I will break to play a little bit of Emily Sandé, and then I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about some of the science that's happened over the last week or so. Welcome back to The Wild Side. That was Emily Sandé with Wonder. And before the break, I was talking about some of the outstanding questions in science, but now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the questions that have actually been answered. And the first of these is the question of how many different types of odors can humans smell? And this might not sound like the most interesting or exciting of questions to you, but researchers have already developed ways of quantifying sensory experiences like taste and vision and hearing. But until this recent study was performed, they hadn't yet come up with a good way to quantify smell. And what they did was they used mathematics to do this, because obviously it's quite difficult to measure something that's a very, subjective experience. So they utilized something called Andrew Dravniak's 1985 Atlas of Odor Character Profiles, which must be a fascinating read. And there are 144 different odors that were within this atlas, and each one is associated with kind of a long list of descriptors. So things like sweet or floral or heavy, and people had smelled things and then associated these terms with the different scents. And what they wanted to do was use statistics to find out which combinations of descriptors were the most important, which ones were used most often without being redundant, what terms were used together, and then you could kind of condense those things down into the minimum number of different scents out there. And what they came up with was a set of 10 different types of odors. Fragrant, woody or resinous, fruity in a non-citrusy way, chemical, minty/peppermint, sweet, popcorn, lemon, pungent, and decayed. And some of these I can definitely relate to. I can totally tell you what minty smells like, but others are a bit more vague to my sense. So things like chemical or pungent. I'm not really sure what that would describe exactly, but these are the terms that they came up with to describe the types of things that we are able to smell. And what they're hoping is that using this knowledge, they can look at chemical structures that are associated with each of those terms or groups of terms, and then use that chemical structure information to then predict what types of chemical structures will be associated with certain flavors and smells, and in reverse, what sort of smell or flavor can we expect from things with those chemical structures. So as we discover new compounds or create new compounds, then perhaps we will be able to, without even smelling them or tasting them, and I am using both of these terms because smell and taste are quite closely related because of the fact that they're both chemical in nature and they involve many of the same receptors. But the idea is that we could potentially not even have to experience these chemicals and still be able to kind of get an idea of what they would be like. And this would be quite interesting, potentially in kind of a culinary setting, and also, of course, in the fragrance industry when you're coming up with new perfumes and other sorts of scents, like in soap and that sort of thing. Now, a kind of related topic, and actually this might be the last one that I have time for today, is how and why Szechuan pepper causes tingling. And these peppers have long been described as having lemony overtones, but also, in addition to that taste, they're associated with kind of a tingling and electric sensation that is very mechanical in nature. It's not just, the scent or the smell, but it's also a feeling in your skin. And the compound that's responsible for this is something called hydroxyl alpha sanshool. And the mechanism behind the activity of this compound has never really been understood. How does the chemical result in a mechanical sensation? What is the neurological activity that's underlying that? And researchers recently performed a 4-part study in order to understand this a bit better. So in the first part, they had a bunch of volunteers and they swabbed their lips with either pepper in an ethanol solution or ethanol plain or water. And then they asked them after each one of those events, did it feel like it was tingling, burning, cooling, warming, and or numbing? And overwhelmingly, people said that the pepper solution and nothing else caused a tingling sensation that had a regular pulse. So this really is something that is isolated, has to do with the pepper itself. So the next thing they did was apply a solution, again with the pepper, to the volunteers' lips, and then apply a mechanical vibration to their fingers. And they were asked to say whether the mechanical vibration on the finger was lower or higher than the one on their lips. And by doing this repeatedly with lots of different volunteers, they were able to make the vibration closer and closer to the frequency that was being felt in the lip, because they would adjust it each time. So this allowed them to figure out that the frequency is approximately 50 hertz. And that is the midpoint of the sensitivity of something called the RA1 afferent fiber. And these are rapidly adapting nerves that are feeling things in the skin and then relaying that information to the brain. So this suggests that they have pinpointed the very type of nerve that was responsible for picking up this information from the chemicals and translating that into a mechanical feeling that the brain tells us we're then feeling. And they double-checked this with an experiment, again using kind of vibration frequencies and looking at the sensitivity of volunteers and assessing whether or not you really can tell what's happening in your lip and what's happening in your finger and kind of relating the two. So they did confirm with that third experiment that this was a valid method of estimating the frequency and kind of getting an idea then of what nerves might be involved in the process. And the final thing that they did was they then tested whether the sensitivity was reduced after there had been a pre-application of another stimulus. And this was something that's interesting because if you've got something that stimulates you really highly and then you pause for a minute and then do another stimulus of the same type, you should be less sensitive that second time around because all your nerves and all your neurons get tired and they stop working quite as well. And you need a bit of time to reset. So if these nerves that they thought were responsible really were responsible, then they should get tired out by a pre-stimulus and then not react as strongly when the pepper was added the second time around, or even when a mechanical stimulus that was quite similar to the pepper was added. And in fact, that is what they found. They used that same kind of frequency range of stimulus and did a little mechanical pre-stimulus, and then they added pepper, or they added a mechanical stimulus after that. And in both cases, the experience was less intense after there had already been adaptation. And this suggested, this kind of confirmed their thoughts that it was these RA1 light touch nerves that were responsible for that tingling sensation, because they were the ones that were sensitive in that frequency range. They were the ones that were being tired out by that mechanical stimulus. So this is quite exciting, because here you've got something that usually is associated with feeling a mechanical stimulus, something that's being touched to your skin, but instead is actually having that same sort of association with something that has got a chemical stimulus. So the pepper seems to have this really unique way of making our brains light up and go into action and tell us what we're feeling. And this could be quite interesting and useful in a culinary setting, because you could design some really interesting kind of gourmet experiences, kind of Heston Blumenthal style. But also it might be really interesting for helping us understand medical conditions, so kind of the pins and needles sensation that we have in association with injuries and other abnormalities. And unfortunately, even though I've got some other things to talk about, I'm going to have to wrap it up there because I'm just about out of time. So I'm going to leave you with Lindsey Sterling playing electric daisy violin, and as always, I'll put information about everything up on the website, and I will see you next week.